In 1973, a group of perfectly healthy people walked into psychiatric hospitals across the United States and told doctors something simple. They said they were hearing voices, and that was all it took. Within hours, every single one of them was admitted. Once inside, the voices stopped. The volunteers behaved completely normally. They told the staff the truth. They said they felt fine. They said they weren't sick. But something unsettling happened. The hospitals didn't believe them. Some of these volunteers were locked inside psychiatric wards for weeks. Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we're exploring one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever conducted: the Rosenhan Experiment. In the early 1970s, American psychiatry was facing a quiet identity crisis. For decades, psychiatric hospitals had operated behind closed doors. Diagnoses were often based on observation, interviews, and professional judgment rather than laboratory tests. Unlike many areas of medicine, there were few clear biological markers that could confirm whether someone truly had a mental illness. And that uncertainty raised an uncomfortable question. How reliable were psychiatric diagnoses? That question would soon be tested in one of the most controversial experiments in the history of psychology. The study was led by psychologist David Rosenhan, a professor at Stanford University. Rosenhan was deeply interested in how mental illness was identified and labeled. He wondered whether psychiatrists could reliably distinguish between people who were mentally ill and people who were completely healthy. It's one thing to diagnose someone who clearly shows symptoms, but what happens when the situation becomes more ambiguous? To explore that question, Rosenhan designed an unusual experiment. He recruited 8 volunteers. They included a graduate student, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a housewife, and several psychologists. In other words, ordinary people with stable lives and no history of serious mental illness. Rosenhan gave them a simple set of instructions. Each volunteer would go to a psychiatric hospital and report hearing unfamiliar voices. The voices were described as saying simple words like empty, hollow, or thud. They weren't threatening, they weren't violent, just strange enough to suggest something might be wrong. Other than that single symptom, the volunteers were instructed to behave completely normally. They were to answer questions honestly. They were to describe their lives accurately. They were to act exactly as they normally would. And once they were admitted to the hospital, they were told to stop pretending entirely. No more voices, no more symptoms, just normal behavior. The volunteers became what Rosenhan called pseudo-patients, fake patients. Healthy individuals entering psychiatric institutions under the assumption that the doctors would eventually realize something unusual was happening. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Between 1969 and 1972, the pseudo-patients visited 12 psychiatric hospitals across the United States. These hospitals varied widely. Some were large state institutions. Others were smaller private facilities. Some were considered modern and progressive. Others were older institutions with reputations for overcrowding. But the result was the same in every single case. Every pseudo-patient was admitted. Every single one. And the diagnoses were strikingly similar. Most of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia. A few received a slightly different label known as manic depressive psychosis, which today would fall under bipolar disorder. But the point was quite clear. Doctors believed the volunteers were genuinely mentally ill, even though the only symptom they had reported was hearing vague voices. Once inside the hospitals, the pseudo-patients immediately stopped pretending. They told staff members they felt fine. They said the voices had disappeared. They behaved calmly and cooperatively. They participated in group activities. They took notes about their experiences. But the hospital staff didn't interpret their behavior the way the volunteers had expected. Instead of seeing healthy individuals, doctors often interpreted normal behavior as part of the illness. Taking notes, for example, was sometimes recorded in patient files as writing behavior. One pseudo-patient's habit of arriving early for meals was documented as oral acquisitive syndrome, a term that suggested psychological dependency. Even ordinary conversations with other patients were sometimes viewed through the lens of psychiatric symptoms. Once the label of mental illness had been applied, everything the pseudo-patients did seemed to reinforce it, and the volunteers soon began noticing something. Life inside these institutions was deeply unsettling. Many psychiatric wards were severely understaffed. Doctors and nurses often spent only a few minutes a day interacting with each patient. Some patients even reported going days without meaningful conversation with medical staff. In many hospitals, staff members avoided eye contact with patients entirely. The pseudo-patients observed nurses distributing medicine without explanation. Patients lined up, swallowed pills, and moved on. The volunteers themselves were expected to take the medications as well, but many quietly disposed of the pills instead of swallowing them. And in most cases, nobody noticed. The hospitals were so overwhelmed with patients that careful observation was rare. Yet perhaps the most revealing moment of the study came from an unexpected source. Not the doctors, not the nurses, but other patients. In several hospitals, real patients approached the pseudo-patients and quietly asked a question. They suspected something. Some said things like, "You're not crazy. You're a reporter, aren't you?" Or, "You're checking up on the hospital." In other words, some of the people actually diagnosed with mental illness seemed to recognize that the pseudo-patients were different, but the trained professionals did not. What do you make of all this? If you want to join the conversation, feel free to leave a comment below or reach out to us on the Midnight Drives hotline, 402-610-2836. In our next segment, we're going to talk about the aftermath and the debate that went hand in hand with the Rosenhan Experiment. Welcome back. Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we are talking about the Rosenhan Experiment. Now, when David Rosenhan's study was published in 1973, it sent shockwaves through the psychiatric community. The paper was titled, "On Being Sane in Insane Places," and it raised a deeply unsettling possibility. If trained psychiatrists could not reliably distinguish healthy individuals from mentally ill patients, then what does that say about the diagnostic system itself? The idea that healthy individuals could be admitted to psychiatric hospitals and remain there for weeks without being identified was deeply troubling. Critics argued that the study exposed some serious flaws in the mental health system. Supporters of psychiatry pushed back. They argued that the experiment wasn't entirely fair. After all, the pseudo-patients had deliberately presented symptoms that would normally justify admission. Hearing voices is considered a serious psychiatric symptom. Doctors are trained to take that very seriously. So some psychiatrists argued that the experiment didn't prove that psychiatric diagnosis was meaningless. Instead, it showed that doctors were responding cautiously to potentially dangerous symptoms. But even critics acknowledged something important. The study revealed serious problems inside psychiatric institutions. See, the pseudo-patients had described environments that were overcrowded, impersonal, and sometimes deeply neglectful. Patients often felt invisible. Many were given little explanation for their treatment. And interactions with medical staff were often brief, distant, and even cold. These observations resonated with broader concerns already growing in the United States. During the 1960s and 1970s, journalists and activists had begun documenting troubling conditions inside some psychiatric hospitals. Large institutions housed thousands of patients. Some had lived there for years, sometimes decades. And public pressure was mounting for reform. Rosenhan's study added fuel to that conversation. It suggested that the problem wasn't only institutional conditions. It might also involve the way psychiatric labels were applied in the first place. The debate grew even more intense when one hospital publicly challenged Rosenhan. Staff members at the respected psychiatric hospital argued that such an embarrassing mistake could never happen at their facility. They claimed their doctors were highly trained and would easily detect fake patients. So, Rosenhan made a proposal. He told the hospital that over the next 3 months, one or more pseudo-patients might attempt to gain admission to their facility. The hospital staff agreed to monitor incoming patients carefully. Doctors were asked to rate each new admission on the likelihood that they might be a fake patient. By the end of the monitoring period, the hospital reported something remarkable. Staff believed they had detected dozens of possible imposters. Patients who seemed suspicious. Patients who might be pretending. Patients who might be part of Rosenhan's experiment. But there was a problem. Rosenhan had sent no pseudo-patients at all. Not a single one. The hospital had identified imposters that did not exist. For Rosenhan, this second result illustrated the deeper problem. Psychiatric diagnosis was not simply about identifying symptoms. It involved interpretation, context, assumptions, and sometimes uncertainty. And yet, despite all of the controversy, the Rosenhan experiment also had important consequences. It helped push the psychiatric field toward more standardized diagnostic criteria. In the years following the study, the American Psychiatric Association introduced major revisions to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM. These revisions aimed to create clearer definitions for psychiatric diagnosis, more structured interviews, more specific symptom checklists. The goal was to make diagnosis more consistent and less dependent on subjective interpretation. In other words, the field began trying to solve the very problem Rosenhan had highlighted. But the story didn't end here. Decades later, the Rosenhan experiment would face criticism of its own. Some researchers questioned aspects of Rosenhan's reporting. They wondered whether all details of the pseudo-patient's experiences had been accurately documented. Others argued that the study exaggerated the case with which people could enter psychiatric hospitals. And in 2008, a British psychologist named Lauren Slater attempted to replicate part of the experiment. She visited several psychiatric clinics and reported hearing a single symptom: a voice saying the word thud. Unlike Rosenhan's pseudo-patients, Slater was not admitted to a hospital. Instead, most doctors prescribed medication and scheduled follow-up appointments. The mental health system had changed significantly since the 1970s. Large psychiatric institutions had largely been replaced by outpatient treatments, shorter hospital stays, and more cautious admissions procedures. In other words, the conditions that made Rosenhan's experiment possible had already begun to disappear. But the study still leaves us with an important question. How do we define mental illness? Unlike many physical diseases, psychiatric conditions often cannot be confirmed with a simple test. They're diagnosed through behavior, self-reported experience, and professional interpretation, which means that context matters. Labels matter. And once someone receives a diagnosis, that label can influence how others perceive their actions. That may be the most unsettling lesson of the Rosenhan experiment. Not that psychiatrists were careless, not that mental illnesses aren't real, but that the boundary between health and illness can sometimes be harder to define than what we might like. And when someone crosses that boundary, even temporarily, it can be surprisingly difficult to cross back.